Chapter 15. Asuncion, Paraguay. The Present. You Victor Grigo? Grigo looked up from his paper and saw a vision from a 40s movie. The young man lounging in his office doorway wore a trench coat, fedora, wide tie, and pleated trousers. Victor peeked over the rim of his desk. Nope, no two-toned wingtips. The suede shoe twitched as a giant tropical cockroach scuttled by. Victor Grigo had a limited social life and made a great deal of use of his VCR. He recognized the look. "Who's asking?" Grigo demanded. Frowning, he tossed the paper aside. It joined other litter, ranging from corn husks stained with tomato sauce and grease to discarded 3.5-inch floppies. In the courtyard behind the two-story building, a cat was calling for love, or at least anticipating fornication. The youngster sauntered over to him and offered a dog-eared business card with a snap and a flourish. Marco Cassetti, private investigator. There was a phone number underneath. "Investigator?" Victor asked. Cassetti grinned sheepishly and shrugged. "I got a discount," he explained. Grigo raised his brows and offered the card back to the kid with 2 fingers. "You got what you paid for," he said. He leaned back in his chair. "So, what can I do for you?" Cassetti twitched his coat aside and hoisted one slim hip onto the corner of Grigo's desk. "Don't do that." Victor made a flicking motion with his hand. "I don't like people sitting on my desk." Cassetti stood up and thrust his hands deep into his pants pockets, trying to look unconcerned, but there was a flush on his cheeks. Grigo narrowed his eyes, wondering how old he was. "Little hee-haw is just shaving, and he's trying out this attitude on me." "So, what do you want?" he asked, restating the question in less hospitable terms. The kid narrowed his eyes. "I just wanted to ask you what you were doing in Villa Hayes," he said. Only it came out in an almost indecipherable Bogart imitation. "What?" Grigo said, his face scrunched up in confusion. Bad enough this kid was in 40s drag. Now he was talking like a gringo with a mouthful of corn mush. "I don't have time for this shit," he declared. "Get to the point or get your misspelled card and your baggy ass out of here." Marco felt a little deflated, but tried not to let it show. Maybe his mother was right, and he should just be himself. He crossed his arms over his chest and took a stance. "I saw you leaving Dieter von Rossbach's party the other night. He didn't seem very happy with you, nor you with him. I was wondering what the story was." Grigo studied him for a long moment. "Oh yeah? Assuming I know anybody named Dieter, and I was at a party the other night, why should I tell you anything?" Victor spread his hands and looked around his grimy little office like it was a palace. "I mean, what's in it for me?" Marco blinked. "That depends on your information." He kept his eyes and voice level, his mouth firm. If Grigo was going to play tough guy, he could go along with the script. Victor tugged the corners of his mouth down. That was a more reasonable answer than he'd expected. "So who wants to know?" he asked. Me, Marco answered, sounding tough, but also slightly surprised, which lent the single word a questioning air. Oh, right. Victor narrowed his eyes. Thing is, I don't want to tell you. Sure you do, Marco said. He looked around and spotted a chair in a corner. He went and got it, placing it right before Grigo's desk. Taking out a handkerchief, he dusted it off and sat down, hoisting the legs of his trousers to preserve the crease. The way von Rossbach treated you, I know I'd want to talk to somebody about it. Cassetti spread his hands. And you know, there's something about a genuinely interested audience. Victor reached over and opened his cigar box. He took out a cheroot, sliced off the end with a clipper, and lit it with an elaborate silver lighter, then blew out a cloud of smoke. Watching the younger man with narrowed eyes, he was amused to notice Cassetti's nostrils twitch slightly at the odor as it reached him. What the hell? He did want to grouse about von Rossbach. He was used to better from the professionals who used his services. They understood that he was a businessman, and a damned honest one. He always delivered what he said, when he said, where he said. And the government people were sensible enough to appreciate that too. So had von Rossbach when they'd done business. It rankled still the way Dieter and his entire household had treated him like filth. And the way the sector agent had dragged him to von Rossbach's estancia without allowing him to pack so much as a change of socks was insulting too. So he wasn't a saint. He was a human being, just like they were, and he deserved some respect. Victor took a deep drag of his cheroot and blew out the evil-smelling vapor across his desk. He almost smiled when the kid's eyes crossed. So, he asked, somewhat soothed by feeling more in control, what did you want to know? Cassetti shrugged. What were you doing in Villa Hayes? So Victor told him. I should have given him the high sign right away, he finished regretfully. But it had been a hard week, and I thought it might be nice to exchange a few words with an old friend. Not to mention her son threatened to kill you, Marco said, a little Bogart creeping back into his syntax. Victor glared at him. Yeah, he said shortly. He shouldn't have mentioned that, but this weird kid was a damn good listener. After a moment, Cassetti asked, So, who is this Sarah Connor? Grigo squinted at him through the smoke and smiled. Who wants to know? He taunted. Me, Marco answered with a shrug. Victor nodded slowly, puffing his cigar. Then he put it in the ashtray. Oh yeah, of course, he said. There you were lurking around Dieter von Rossbach's house out in Villa Hayes because you enjoy sitting around in thornbrakes all night. Isn't that right? Marco tilted his head back, his hands clasped across his stomach. He wiggled his fingers, but said nothing. You decided one day just to look into the life of some total stranger, some immigrant estanciero, right? Like after your movie career, you want to become a vaquero. Grigo picked up the cigar again and rolled it between his fingers. What did you do? Fall in love with him? Marco sat forward, grasping the arms of the chair. Hey, he protested. Victor waved him back, grinning. Just yanking your chain, kid. He took a drag of his cheroot. But I gave you some good information there. He gestured with the cigar. I think you owe me some. Cassetti glared at the older man, but he was also thinking. He had been given some information. How valuable, he didn't know just now, but a little research should answer that question. He didn't want to alienate Grego either. One never knew when a good source might be needed. I have a client, he allowed. A woman. Victor raised his eyebrows. This had a client. Whoever it was must have been desperate. Local? He asked, interested. Marco shook his head. She's in the US. Oh, ho, Victor said, very interested. That explained how he got hired. The proverbial pig in a poke. This woman have a name? But Marco shook his head. Sorry, he said. That is privileged information. He waited a beat, then asked, So, what is this Connor woman to von Rossbach? Are they lovers? Grego laughed so hard he almost choked. The idea of a sector agent, even an ex-agent, having an affair with Sarah Connor, mad bomber, was too much. I'll take that as a no, Cassetti said dryly. Victor shook his head as he stubbed out the cheroot. He coughed a few more times, then settled back to look at the odd young man across from him. So, he said at last, what's my information worth to you? Marco rose and resettled his trench coat around him. I'll have to get back to you on that. Hey! Victor snarled, scowling. I'm not jerking you around, Cassetti assured him. I just don't have enough information right now. When I do, then I'll know what this is worth. And then I'll see to it that you get what's coming to you. He tugged down the brim of his fedora. I'll be in touch. He turned and left without another word. Grego watched him go with a frown. What a jerk, he thought. Serena Burns' home, the present. Sarah Connor, Luddite terrorist or victim of government conspiracy? Serena was pleased with the look of her new webpage. She was particularly proud of such touches as leaving out the question marks in the heading. Very human, she thought, with the satisfaction of an artist viewing a finished painting. Outside, children were playing and a dog barked. She had arranged all of the material that was available to the public in such a way that it appeared to have a distinctly sinister slant. The words government conspiracy would drag in thousands of malcontents and agitators looking for a cause to make their own. Luddite was a word that had a growing following too. So she looked forward to finding a lively and hopefully seditious discussion going on in the chat room she'd created. Best of all, none of it could be traced back to her. It could be traced to Kurt Weimeister, but only if you knew your way around the system. And there was a convincing effort to cover the tracks. Serena grinned. She was certainly over her awe of Skynet's tutor. She frowned slightly as she read the postings. A large number of the government conspiracists wanted Sarah Connor to have been abducted by aliens. Well, Serena thought, if you consider killer robots from the future alien. She began to type a message under the name Kerry. I heard that she was being chased by a guy who couldn't be killed, Kerry wrote. Oh, come on, Cyberdude sneered. What do you think, that she was being chased by vampires? Cyberdude had been one of the most adamant regarding Connor's abduction by government-sponsored extraterrestrials. She'd also noticed that people in chat rooms were far more verbally aggressive than they would dare to be in person. The Luddites were a more serious bunch, and their discussion tended towards issues that might have given rise to the Sarah Connor story in the first place. If you only knew, Serena thought. She created a private chat room for them and invited them in. The conspiracy enthusiasts were fun, but she sensed she could actually use the Luddites. After all, somewhere among them might lurk the scientists who would one day create her. Which is an excellent reason to encourage them, Serena thought. All in all, the site was going well. She checked the addresses of those who had signed on to check it out. No one from Paraguay. Oh well, it's early days yet, she thought. I'll just give it some time. Logic dictated that someone she was looking for would hear of the site and come to look at it. With a slight mental twitch, she began to sort the data. The phone rang and she accessed the call, noting that it was coming from Paraguay. Burns, she said crisply. Cassetti, Marco replied, trying to sound just as tough and businesslike. Serena smiled. He couldn't be much over 19 from his voice, and she couldn't help but be amused by his efforts to sound more mature. Ah, Senor Cassetti, she cooed. I was just thinking about you. What do you have for me? She asked breathlessly. A little sigh trickled over the phone, so soft that only her augmented hearing could have picked it up. She had to fight down the urge to laugh. Senor Cassetti, she prompted. Yes, he said. I went to Villa Hayes to do some investigating last night. There was the sound of paper being handled. And I watched von Rossbach's estancia until 11 o'clock. He held a small gathering, 2 couples, a single woman, and a gunrunner named Victor Grigo. I observed some sort of disagreement apparently taking place between Grigo and von Rossbach. Today, I approached Grigo and questioned him about what had occurred. Serena's eyebrows rose sharply as he spoke. This was much better than she'd expected. She wondered about the single woman, but held her peace. Let the human work. It's what you're paying him for. Grigo informed me that Senor von Rossbach is retired from a covert operations organization. He didn't have much in the way of details. Marco allowed a slightly apologetic tone to creep into his voice. I hope to learn more with further investigation. The woman, Serena thought impatiently. Who is the woman? Grigo also informed me that the single woman who attended the dinner party was Sarah Connor. Who? Serena said ingenuously. Inside, she was crowing. This was too easy. she thought. Clearly, Connor thought she was safe and had grown careless. There was a slight pause. I'm sorry to say, Senorita, that this Connor woman is a wanted terrorist. Marco wanted to tell her that the man she was interested in might be in danger. But he also wondered if someone from a covert operations organization shouldn't know all about Sarah Connor. And if he did, and he was having her over to dinner with a gun smuggler, well, that implied all sorts of things. Since he didn't know which to say, he decided to say nothing. Oh dear, Serena said, putting a great deal of distress into her voice. This is very important information you found. I think I should send one of my employees down there. She accessed flight information and booked a ticket as she spoke. Could you rent another car, darling, and meet him at the airport? He's arriving at 1:15. Si, señorita. Marco answered automatically, transported to the edge of ecstasy by the word, darling. Serena allowed her voice to go breathy again. Oh, thank you, she said, putting enough feeling into it to suggest, you big, strong, capable man you, was also being said. 1:15, remember? She made a kissing sound and broke the connection. I shouldn't have enjoyed that so much. Serena scolded herself. But she had, and she felt wonderfully wicked because of it. She was also pleased that her first Terminator had returned unscathed from such a successful trial run. She'd program him for Spanish immediately. Serena went to a file cabinet and drew out a folder. Inside were the false documents she'd just received for her first Terminator. Her timing had been excellent. Oh, she thought, proud and pleased. This should be a piece of cake. She sent a silent command that summoned her most experienced Terminator from its work in the cellar. It came, massive and impassive, smelling slightly of chemicals and mold, standing with an eerie motionlessness before her desk. Sarah Connor is in Villa Hayes, Paraguay, she told it. You will be flown to Paraguay tomorrow. You will be met at the airport in Asuncion by a human named Marco Cassetti. He will take you to Villa Hayes. Have him find out for you exactly where she can be found. Go there, kill her. Kill her son, John, who is 16. Terminate any witnesses. This will also include anyone Marco Cassetti might have spoken to about Connor. Mission priority is to remain undetected, followed by the termination of John and Sarah Connor. Prioritize your actions according to circumstances. For a moment, she considered having von Rossbach terminated, then decided against it. The last thing she wanted was an organization like the Sector taking an interest in her affairs. Return to the airport in Asuncion, she continued. Park the car in the lot there. Your return flight is at 8 o'clock. Contact me if there are any significant deviations from the plan. She sat it down and uploaded a Spanish program from her own internal computer. The Terminator would be fluent in under an hour. There was some information on Guarani. She downloaded what was available, as well as a sort of short text on the local customs and political situation. Then it would turn to studying maps of the area. She'd drive it to the airport herself tomorrow morning. It was still stiff in its manner, but she didn't think it would attract attention to itself. It just wouldn't make any friends. Von Rossbach Estancia, Paraguay. The present. Dieter sat in his office in the late afternoon, studying the police reports that Jeff had sent him. The light breeze carried a hint of roses from the garden, and he looked up and out into the fading sunlight on the whitewashed adobe, enjoying the tremble of bougainvillea for a moment before he returned to his reading. These were the unadulterated versions of the Sarah Connor file, complete with personal notations in the margins by people who had been there, files the public would never see. And he could understand why. They were completely unbelievable. The first time in her life that Sarah Connor came to the attention of the police for more than a parking ticket was the day that 2 other women with the same name were shot to death in LA. Execution-style hits, he noted. 1 large caliber pistol round in the head, then the magazine emptied into the body. She heard about the second killing on the news and called the police from a nightclub. Dieter smiled at the club's self-consciously clever name, Tech Noir. Before the police could get to her, there was a shootout in the club. Witnesses said that the main aggressor was a very big man in a grubby jacket decorated with chains. They claimed that though he'd been shot multiple times, he got up and ran after 2 people who escaped from the back of the club. Kevlar vests were just coming into wide use then, he thought. The people who ran were Sarah Connor and a man who called himself Kyle Reese. He claimed to be a soldier from the future sent back to protect Connor from a killing machine he called a Terminator. The next part of the report included a videotape of a man in sunglasses and a leather jacket walking through a police station, calmly shooting anyone who got in his way. He did not miss anyone who fired at him, and he usually killed anyone at whom he leveled his weapon. Even I can't do that, Dieter thought, watching the man use an automatic shotgun as if it were a pistol. And I'm better than most with a gun. He could also swear, though the picture was really too grainy to be certain, that this man was shot by the police defending the station. Dieter shook his head. One of the few survivors suggested that he was hopped up on PCP, but he seemed too controlled to von Rossbach. There was none of the bug-eyed, teeth-bared wildness that was a trademark of the drug. If the man hadn't been so obviously real, he'd have sworn that this was a CGI animation rather than an actual human being. Reese and Connor had fled the police station together and taken refuge in a motel. Somehow, the maniac, being relentlessly single-minded, succeeded in tracing them, something the police were unable to do until well after the fact. What followed, according to the report, was an extremely violent chase involving a tank truck that was completely destroyed in an explosion. Connor and Reese then sought shelter in a nearby factory, which was also severely damaged. At the end of the night, Kyle Reese was dead. Sarah Connor was hospitalized with various wounds and shock. Her mother, her roommate, and her roommate's friend were dead. And there was property damage left in their wake to the tune of almost $1 million. Upon her release from the hospital, after what must have been the worst night of her life, Sarah Connor, then pregnant, had gone to Mexico, Central America, and farther south. Eventually, she had sought out mercenaries, gun runners, and smugglers, dragging her little boy behind her and talking about the end of the world. A corner of Dieter's mouth lifted. Well, a lot of those types are crazy too. She probably fit right in. I pity the poor kid, though. He picked up the report on John Connor. Trespassing, shoplifting, disturbing the peace, vandalism. He was quite the little hoodlum under his court-appointed foster parents' care. He'd been placed with Todd and Janelle Voigt after his mother had been shot and arrested for attempting to blow up a computer factory. With a sigh, von Rossbach put aside the report. Given John's upbringing and the things he'd been taught to believe, there must have been an unbridgeable gulf between him and the Voights. With his mother in an institution and everything in his life a lie, it was no wonder he'd rebelled. His mind turned to the boy he'd recently met. That young man seemed so centered, so assured. It was difficult to imagine him as a petty thief, or the intimate of mercenaries and madmen. Dieter picked up the other report and read for a while, then flipped to the end, to the section on Connor's raid on Cyberdyne. This time, bizarrely, the man who'd been attempting to murder Connor had been at her side. The casualty report almost made his jaw drop. The sheer numbers were incredible. Amazingly, most had been shot in the leg. None were killed. This I know I couldn't do, Dieter thought in awe. Gunshot wounds in the leg were dangerous. There were too many ways a bullet could sever a major vein. He was hit numerous times. One of the side notes insisted. His clothing was shredded by the impacts and his face was covered in blood. You could see bone where the flesh had been stripped away. And after this, he had disabled every man there, walked out and stolen a van, and then driven away. What human being could do that? Dieter wondered. Even on PCP. He shook his head and turned the page, finding that one death listed was the result of a helicopter pilot taking a high dive out of his craft. An apparent suicide. Dieter stopped and contemplated that. It was one of those truly inexplicable, senseless things. Subsequent investigation indicated that the man showed none of the usual signs of a potential suicide. The helicopter had crashed more than 14 miles away from the site of the so-called suicide. The incident plucked his instincts like harp strings. Taken with the known cop killer's sudden humanitarian instincts, it was one too many strange events. Unless Sarah Connor and this Kyle Reese were telling the truth all along. But that was insane. Speaking of which, he snatched up the copy of Connor's medical records and began trying to make sense of the jargon that described her condition. He winced at the amount of anti-schizophrenia drugs she'd been given. No wonder Teresa Dyson described her as out of control. He noted that Miles Dyson's brother, Jordan, was an FBI agent who had contributed a number of leads to the investigation. Perhaps he should call him. Maybe the chief project manager's brother would know why Cyberdyne. True, Connor had attacked other companies, but there'd never been a shootout like this one. Though to be fair, there's never been a shootout like this one anytime, anywhere, ever. Dieter checked the time. Dyson would still be at work, unless he was in the field. It was worth a try. With usual FBI efficiency, he soon found himself speaking to a secretary assigned to Dyson's office. He identified himself as former sector agent and asked to speak to him. There was an infinitesimal pause. Then she said, "I'm sorry, Mr. von Rossbach, but former Special Agent Dyson is no longer with the FBI." "That was rather sudden, wasn't it?" Dieter asked. "I don't know," she said, then went silent, patiently waiting for his next question. Dieter racked his brain and pulled out the name of another agent he knew who worked in counter-terrorism. "Well then, is Special Agent Paulson there?" "Yes, sir. I'll connect you." A few clicks later, the phone was picked up. "Paulson," a distracted voice said. "Patricia," von Rossbach said. "How are you?" "Dieter?" She gave a surprised laugh. "I thought you'd retired." "I have, but I'm thinking of writing a book. Not something I've investigated. The Sarah Connor thing." "That's a weird one," Paulson commented. He heard the click of keys and knew she was only giving him half her attention. "So I was trying to get in touch with Jordan Dyson to see if I could get some insight. But your secretary tells me he's left the FBI. When did that happen?" Today, actually," she said. The keyboard sounds stopped. "He went into the supervisor's office this morning, and the next thing I knew, he was clearing out his desk." "Why?" Dieter asked. "He's a good agent, from what I hear." "Was he fired?" No, nothing like that," Patricia said. "He was a good agent, but under the circumstances, the soup thought he should go immediately." "What circumstances?" Von Rossbach prodded. "He's going to work for Cyberdyne, which, if you've been investigating this case, must ring a bell." "Yes, it does," he said slowly. "That's a surprise. And no mistake. But from what he said, he should do very well there. The bennies are every bit as good as ours, sometimes better, and the pay definitely is. Had I but known they were looking," she said wistfully. "You'd have told them to look elsewhere," Dieter said. "You know you'll never leave the bureau." "Yeah," she agreed. "I'll die in harness or be put out to pasture." "I'm not even going to comment on that analogy," Dieter said, putting a grin into his voice. "Listen, do you think you'll be talking to him again?" "Maybe," she answered. "Then would you mind giving him my number, in case he's willing to talk to me?" She was silent for a moment, then said, "Sure, why not?" "Thanks," he said. "Good talking to you, Pat." He hung up the phone and leaned back in his chair, thinking. This case had something missing. The whole shape of it cried out for that missing piece and said that with that it would all come together. He began reviewing the information he had. Cyberdyne was starting up a facility on military property, a buried facility, and they'd been given something that Connor had stolen during her raid. Now Miles Dyson's brother was going to work for them. Why? Perhaps because he believed that sooner or later word would get to Sarah Connor, assuming she was still alive, and that she might react by going after Cyberdyne again. Dieter nodded. Not an unreasonable assumption, he thought. and went back to the beginnings of the file. Now, Sarah Connor, a perfectly ordinary young woman, a waitress and part-time college student, of no particular ambition, no known political affiliations, just a middle-class girl starting out in life. She's attacked and almost killed by a man intent on murdering women with her name. Dieter picked up the first set of reports and flipped pages. "Ah," he said aloud. The company where she and Kyle Reese had taken refuge, where Reese was killed and where Connor claimed to have killed the Terminator, was a test bed facility for industrial robotics, for a little startup outfit called Cyberdyne. He sat back, lowering the report onto his lap. "Well, there's the connection with Cyberdyne," he thought. Not to mention that at first Cyberdyne had pressed for prosecution of the young woman for trespassing, destruction of property, vandalism, you name it, to the full extent of the law. Then, within a day or so, cooler, more compassionate heads apparently prevailed, and the charges against her were dropped. Still, lying in your hospital bed with that kind of lawsuit hanging over your head, even for just a day, was bound to make an indelible impression. Maybe she'd eventually come to place the blame for the catastrophe that had overtaken her on them. He'd seen people make stranger connections, and certainly the experiences she'd been through were enough to unsettle anyone's mind. And she'd been almost helpless when this thing started. She sure isn't helpless now, Dieter thought. She was still high on the international most wanted list. Not that she was known for certain to have actually killed anyone, but she was a very efficient bomber. Still, despite the Cyberdyne connection, it wasn't the first company she'd attacked. She'd hit a number of companies around the US, all of them specializing in artificial intelligence research. Most hadn't been able to start up again. Then she escapes from the institution and makes a beeline for Cyberdyne. Why? What was different? Dieter thought for a moment. The cop killer, he thought. This time he was with her, fighting for her, not trying to kill her. He rubbed a big hand over his face and frowned. So this guy disappears completely for 10 years. And after killing 17 cops, the dragnet for him was one of the most comprehensive of the 20th century. Then he shows up helping the woman he tried so hard to kill. Did psychotics ever do that? Do a 180 and suddenly offer succor and support to those they'd once marked for death? Well, whether they did or not, that's what appeared to have happened this time, much to Cyberdyne's sorrow. So, was the Cyberdyne raid just another shot in the dark against the supercomputer that Kyle Reese said was going to destroy mankind? Or was it the displacement of Sarah Connor's guilt onto an innocent corporation? Or was Kyle Reese telling the truth? Certainly, Sarah Connor had been inactive since the Cyberdyne raid, despite the fact that Cyberdyne had started up other facilities. Connor had ignored them. This would seem to indicate one of two things. She was dead, or she was convinced that she had destroyed Cyberdyne's capacity to create that devil computer and was unaware of Cyberdyne's resurgence. And if she did become aware of it? A sudden image of Suzanne's face came into his mind. She looked so much like Sarah Connor. And when she first saw me, she ran like a rabbit. And whom did he just happen to resemble? The cop killer, who, the last time he was on the scene, was her friend and helper. So why run? Ah! Dieter rubbed his head vigorously. This was making the inside of his head itch. There was no help for it. He was going to have to confront Suzanne. He reached for the phone and dragged it over. Might as well get it over with. Wilmington, Delaware. The present. Jordan opened the door to find Pat Paulson and 2 other agents on his doorstep, pizza and 6-packs in hand. They crowded in, not even waiting for his invitation. The scent of double cheese, pepperoni and anchovies wafted enticingly from the cardboard carton, and he just decided to order Italian rather than Chinese. "First we eat," Paulson said. "Then we pack." Jordan raised his hands helplessly and let them drop. "You guys," he said helplessly, grinning. "What? We're going to let you do it all yourself?" Pat said. "Solidarity!" one of the others cried, and everybody answered, "You sound like a union," Jordan said, laughing. "And you got anchovies. You never get anchovies when we order pizza." "Hey," Weston said, popping open a can of beer and handing it to him. "Paulson says you've landed this dream job. Make me jealous. Tell me everything." So he did, and as Paulson said, they ate, they drank, they packed. As the evening drew to a close, he saw that he had very little left to do, and he was grateful. "Hey, you guys." He spread his hands. "Thanks." There was a chorus of, "Hey, no problem," and "What are friends for?" Jordan shook his head, his grin fading to seriousness. "I'm gonna miss you," he said, and he meant it. Unlike his family, the Bureau had never let him down. But he knew in his heart that Teresa and Danny would take him back in a minute. Unfortunately, it would be difficult, make that probably impossible, to return to the Bureau. And that hurt. It hurt a lot. "Aw, you gonna have me crying," O'Hara said, and she hugged him. The men shook his hand, and Pat hugged him and bussed his cheeks loudly. "Oh," she said, "I almost forgot. Dieter von Rossbach called the office today looking for you." "Who?" Jordan asked, frowning. "He used to be an agent with the Sector, but now he's retired. He said he was thinking of writing a book about the Cyberdyne case, and he wanted your input." Jordan's face went still, and he put his hands on his hips, shifting from one foot to the other. She shook her head affectionately. "If it was anybody else, I wouldn't have taken his number," she said, holding up a slip of paper. "But he was with the Sector, and he was one of their best. You could do worse than talk to him." She shrugged, then slapped him on the upper arm. "It's up to you, babe." Jordan took the slip of paper and looked at it thoughtfully. "Thanks." He looked up at her from under his brows. She grinned and shook a warning finger at him. "You keep in touch, you hear?" He kissed her cheek and waved to the others as they drove off, then closed the door, looking at the number with a frown. Maybe, but not right now. Right now, he still had some odds and ends of packing to take care of. Jordan looked around and realized that if he pushed it, he could finish the job tonight. His lips twisted wryly. Not a lot to show for 5 years, he thought. Of course, he was a bachelor and often on the road. His home was more of a convenience than anything else, slightly more intimate than a hotel room. What does that say about me, I wonder? Instead of answering himself, he picked up an empty box and marched briskly into the bedroom. I will not become maudlin, he thought. That way lies regret. And regret led to doubt, and doubt led to failure. And he already had plenty of that to deal with. Thank you. Los Angeles International Airport, the present. Serena dropped the Terminator off at the terminal and drove away. She glanced in the rearview mirror and watched it disappear inside, carry-on luggage in hand. The I-950 felt a faint pang of wistfulness, such as she imagined a human might feel when dropping her child off for its first day of school. That is, if you can consider the termination of Mary Warren and her friends to be kindergarten. She thought wryly, swerving to avoid a car with New Mexico license plates, whose driver had apparently never heard of turn signals. Things were definitely looking up. Paul Warren was coming back to work today, and a meeting he would chair was scheduled for tomorrow. About time, she thought. While he'd been away, he'd been completely beyond her reach. Best of all, within the day, the threat the Connors posed would be eliminated. Serena could not help but be elated. If only she continues to be so complacent, she thought. It was to be hoped that Connor would focus on von Rossbach as her greatest danger, leaving herself and her son vulnerable to the Terminator that had been dispatched to destroy them. It could still fail, others had. But there were more of them here now, and that would make all the difference. Cyberdyne, Skynet Laboratory, the present. The subhuman knowingly poisons the pure blood of the Aryan female with sexual diseases. Where the Jew is, syphilis follows as plague follows rats. Serena blinked at the sound of the flat, slightly aspirated voice as it recited. There were just the beginnings of the voice she'd heard since birth in it, and something swelled in her breast at the sound. Incapable of genuine creativity, the Semite, with devilish cunning, poisons and pollutes the well of culture on which he is simultaneously a parasite. She frowned as she listened to what the computer was actually reciting. What kind of nonsense is this? She asked herself. She glanced over at Kurt Weimeister, who was intently watching a voice scan monitor. What is it reciting? She asked aloud. Kurt looked up, frowning distractedly. Then his eyes cleared as he recognized her. Serena, he said with pleasure. He rose and came over to her, kissing her on the cheek. She smiled but stepped back. Then she gestured towards the speakers. If the Jew were to achieve his aim of destroying the culture-bearing Aryan race, the parasite would perish without his host, and Earth would be empty of true humanity. "What is that?" she repeated. "Oh," Kurt said, actually looking shy. "It's necessary for the program to read aloud, to learn syntax and so forth. I thought I might as well have it recite something I've enjoyed reading myself." "Oh." Serena blinked, and had all she could do to keep from laughing. This is where it began, she suddenly thought. Skynet's desire, for want of a better word, to destroy what it saw as a dangerous, devious species. Kurt Weimeister's particular obsession would ultimately lead to billions of human deaths. What was really delicious was that those differences that loomed so large for him were, in reality, minuscule and completely unimportant. But these texts that the as-yet unconscious computer recited in innocence would one day work to convince Skynet that the whole race had to go. It really is funny, she thought. And just for a moment she longed intensely for someone to share the joke with. Oh, not good, she thought in instant dismay. That's too human an emotion. Time to withdraw, time to center herself. "I'm sorry, but I've come to say that I have to cancel our lunch, Kurt," she said. "My new assistant is going to be able to get away more quickly than we'd anticipated, and I've got to oversee the selection of his new quarters." "Have your secretary do it," Kurt said, frowning. He moved closer in one of those dominance gestures he was so fond of. "She's already done most of the work," Serena admitted, refusing to back up. "But the actual selection is something I feel I should do." She smiled at him. "It's a good idea to keep the team happy." Weimeister snorted contemptuously. "Personally, I find it's better to scare them. If you treat them too well, they just goof off and nothing gets done." She gave him a look so steely it reached him even through the fog of his enormous ego. His smile faltered, but hung on bravely. "I'd really hate to think anyone imagined they could take advantage of me like that," she said. He leaned closer, his voice soft, and his eyes held promises. "I would never do that," he said. "No," she agreed. Then she gave him a tight little smile. "I think you would have better sense." "Got to go." She fitted action to words. Kurt blinked. "Can we reschedule?" he asked as she walked away. Serena turned and walked backwards for a few steps as she crossed the lab. "It'll be a while," she said with a shrug. "You know how it is when you're training someone. It takes up all your free time, of which I already have very little." She grinned and gave him a wave and was out the door before he could reply. Well, she thought, that should take care of that. And once he got a load of her new assistant, he would probably blow a gasket. Amazing, she thought, how such a brilliant mind could belong to such an unmitigated jerk. Then she smiled as she thought of him training Skynet to destroy the whole human race, not just the parts he disapproved of. Serena's home, the present. And time to put the backup plan into high gear, Serena thought, looking at the map of Montana. Very different from her own time. There had been a lot of military installations there, and the wilderness had suffered much during the machine-human war. While talking to the realtor about Jordan Dyson's temporary apartment, she'd also arranged the purchase of a very remote but luxurious hunting cabin near the Idaho border. Now she would send her second Terminator there to set up. She arranged an airline ticket and purchased a Jeep for it from a dealer located near the airport. "My mission parameters?" it said while dicing carrots for her dinner. Its own biological parts could survive on a puree of nutrients, but then it didn't have a hindbrain or a sense of taste the way she did. "More slowly," she said, as the ever-sharp ceramic blade blurred into a white disk of motion. "Use a suboptimal speed. You would be very conspicuous if you were under observation." "Affirmative," the Terminator said. Serena sipped at her coffee. Then she told it about the flight to Montana, describing every facet in detail, covering contingencies and whether and how they might require a response. She told it about the Jeep it would pick up from the dealer and all the intricacies it would have to navigate to acquire it. Then she set it up with a driving learning program, a downloaded owner's manual, and the state driving laws for Montana. She would have to hurry and get it a driver's license. She'd pay a huge premium for a rush job, but it would be worth it. She had a sudden sense that things were moving into high gear. When it was finished with its task, she told it, "When ready, you will set up a business debugging software." Serena uploaded the pertinent information on business and current computing from her memory. "The humans you deal with will mostly be socially aberrant, and so will be less likely to suspect anything out of the ordinary. Once your business is operational, I want you to acquire a female of childbearing age. 18 or 19 years old should be perfect. She should be a runaway, and no one must see you collect her. She must be healthy, so be sure of that. I will provide you with the means to set up a complete med lab once you're settled. If she has AIDS or any other incurable disease, terminate her. If she is addicted to drugs, you will have to be sure her system is clear. When the subject is ready, inform me, and I will send you a fertilized egg to implant in her. When the child is born, terminate the mother. I will give you further instructions once the child has proven viable. Do you understand your mission parameters?" "Affirmative." "How I wish it was this simple and direct with humans," Serena thought fervently as the Terminator lumbered towards the stairs to the cellar, and she pushed the diced carrots, onions, snow peas, and cubed pork into a wok. The food sizzled, sending up a sharp, mouth-watering smell of cooking garlic and soya. Humans were idiots who found reasons to be dysfunctional and obstructive out of sheer boredom. It's a wonder that the species survived to be destroyed by their own creation. But it wasn't really a wonder that their own creation wanted to destroy them. I know I do.